Okay, welcome everyone to the 2021 Parthemos lecture series. We are honored today to have a distinguished visitor from the University of North Carolina. Before I introduce our speaker for today, though, I want to say a few things about George Parthemos and the Parthemos family. So George Stephen Parthemos served with great distinction here at the University of Georgia. It started in 1953, and he continued to work here until his death in 1984. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa, one of the, if not the, most distinguished honorary societies, and received his PhD from UNC Chapel Hill. Coincidentally, Professor Baumgartner is visiting us from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. George Parthemos served as the head of the department here at the University of Georgia for 2 years. He was vice president of instruction from 1964 to 1971. He was given an Alumni Foundation Distinguished Professorship, and he also received the Distinguished Faculty Service Alumni Award. George was gifted in many aspects of academia, but he was an especially gifted instructor. And upon his death, his wife, Georgia Parthemos, established this fund and a fund in his memory to create this lecture series. This lecture series has brought in numerous distinguished speakers over the years. We have had one Nobel laureate. We have had numerous presidents of the American Political Science Association. We've had members of the National Academy of Science. We've had members of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Today, the Parthemos Lecture Fund is supported by Elaine Stevens, daughter of George and Georgia Parthemos. I never had the honor to meet George Parthemos. I have met both Georgia, who is now passed away, and also Elaine. And they have both been very generous to the University of Georgia and the Department of Political Science, and I thank them for that. So today's speaker is Frank R. Baumgartner. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan, and he currently holds the Richard B. Richardson Distinguished Professorship in Political Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Much of his work focuses on how public policies are made in democracies, with particular attention given to lobbying, issue definition, framing, agenda setting, including the role of media and elections. He's a co-creator of the Comparative Agendas Project, which tracks public policy activities over long periods of time. Over 20 national project teams are now active in this growing network, with hundreds of publications having resulted from this work. For the faculty among our audience today, I'm sure many of you have used the Comparative Agendas Project data. I myself have. More recently, Professor Baumgartner has developed and sustained a research program focused on issues of racial disparity in the criminal justice system, having published 2 award-winning books on one on the death penalty and another on traffic stops. Over the course of his career, Professor Baumgartner has published articles in the most distinguished political science journals. He's also published 10 books and edited various others. His works include Agendas and Instability in American Politics, The Politics of Attention, The Politics of Information, Lobbying and Policy Change, The Decline of the Death Penalty, and the Discovery of Innocence, Deadly Justice, A Statistical Portrait of the Death Penalty, Suspects, Citizens, What 20 Million Traffic Stops Tell Us About Policing, and also edited volumes. Most notably, especially for the Parthemos lecture, is some of these works were co-authored by undergraduates at the University of North Carolina. That's an element of mentorship that the Parthemos family would be very proud of. In addition to Professor Baumgartner's tremendous breadth, his work has been recognized for its data-driven clarity. It's won prestigious awards, including the Aaron Wildavsky Award for an enduring contribution to the field of public policy, the Gladys M. Kammerer Award for the best book on US national policy, the Leon Epstein Outstanding Book Award on Political Organizations and Parties, the Lewis Brownlow Award for the best book in the field of public administration, and the Herman C. Pritchett Award from the Law and Courts section for the best book in that area. I'm beginning to believe that Professor Baumgartner can't write a book without receiving an award. In 2011, Baumgartner received the Samuel J. Eldersfeld Award for Career Achievement from the APSA section on political parties and organizations. He was inducted in 2017 to be a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2019 was recognized with the Leiper, Jaworski, and Verba Dataset Award from the APSA section on comparative politics for the Comparative Agendas Project. I've known Frank for many years, probably starting in the mid-90s, and he's always been generous of his time, and I appreciate this opportunity to hear from him today. So if we were all in person together, I would ask everyone to give a warm and hearty welcome to Professor Frank Baumgartner. And I know this is an unusual format, and I thank everyone for giving this unusual format a try today. So without further ado, Professor Frank Baumgartner.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that really generous introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be selected to be your speaker for this wonderful endowed speaker series that the family was so nice to establish, and I know it means a lot. I want to say that it's a pleasure to speak in Athens. I look forward to coming in person at some point in the future. I was telling Scott that my last trip was for a job interview where I did not get the job back in 1986. And so it's been a long time, and I'm sure that town has changed. But I would very much look forward to visiting town. I want to talk today about some of my recent research, but I want to give a little background. Some of you, the professors and grad students, may be familiar with some of the work that Scott mentioned. And, you know, frankly, it's got nothing to do with criminal justice whatsoever. And much of my career was spent in other areas. And I wanted to mention a little bit about how I got interested in this question, or the questions that I'll be talking about today. I had long been interested in how governments set their agendas and how social movements and political actors and lobbyists attempt to change the agendas and the focus of government and get them to do different things, and how government policies change. An important part of that is how we describe or understand or frame or spin public policy issues. And I spent my career studying that question, among others. And I got interested in about 20 years ago in how the death penalty was framed. And I was no expert on capital punishment or criminal justice matters at all, but I had studied framing before. And so I organized a research project, and actually it was with a senior honors student whose work started this project, where we analyzed the media framing of the death penalty over a long period of time. And we ended up publishing a book in 2008 about the death penalty. And we described what we call the Discovery of Innocence, which is a discovery of something that was not new at all, since we had executed people accused of witchcraft back in Salem, Massachusetts in the 1700s. So we know that they were innocent of witchcraft, at least I'm pretty sure. So we've always had innocent people on death row, but we hadn't been paying attention to that phenomenon until around the late 1990s. So my book was a description of how that happened, and then the impact of that shift in the way that we talk about the death penalty with that so-called Discovery of Innocence. Once I had published that book, I was a little bit hooked into the study of the death penalty because it's a fascinating and awful topic. And one cannot understand the death penalty, and indeed most criminal justice matters, without delving deep into something that I hadn't really focused on a lot in my previous work, which is identity. Race, social class, gender, age, geography, and other matters, in particular poverty, and in the death penalty case, some other matters that I won't go into today. But anyway, I got very interested in the question of identity in politics. And I knew that to really understand criminal justice, one had to get in much deeper into those issues of identity. Shortly after arriving here in North Carolina, I was asked by some of the attorneys that I had met through my work on the death penalty if I would volunteer to analyze a CD of data that had been collected by the state of North Carolina but had never been looked at. I don't believe anyone had ever even opened up the data files that had, so the state of North Carolina had been collecting traffic stop statistics for quite some time, but they were just going into an empty folder, so to speak. So that's the background of how I got involved in this. So I'm gonna share my slides and hopefully interest you in, or take you some distance into the study of traffic stops. And I wanna start with two videos that are essentially dash cam videos of traffic stops that really give an idea of what I'm going to be talking about with a lot of numbers. But these two videos, one comes from Texas, and you'll see a highway patrol team pulling over a car, or it's actually a work truck. And the officers or the troopers are suspicious of this truck because they say it's just too clean to be a work truck. And they proceed to have a conversation with the man who's driving the truck. And at the end, after they find out that he's a city councilman, they continue to search his truck and they don't find anything. So they finally let him go with an explanation that, you know, you can never be too careful, and they didn't have any suspicion about his activity, which is questionable, but that, you know, they see a lot of things out there on the highway, and they should, he should understand that it's a dangerous world and there's kidnapped children and things like that, explaining why they were searching his truck. And then the second example is a young, 17 or 18-year-old young African-American man pulled over for a quote-unquote illegal right turn in Louisville, Kentucky. And I won't show you the entire video of that encounter. His mother arrives at the scene and has a conversation with the officer. But it's very clear from the beginning of this that this young man had no business being arrested by the police. And indeed, they dropped all charges against him, and it led to a huge controversy. But it was pretty routine practice. So let me show you these two short videos very briefly.
Oil field. There's not a scratch on the truck. How long have you been working this truck? Man, a little over a month. There's no scratches on it. Yeah, we take care of it. It's not dirty. Yeah, we keep it clean. I smell fresh paint. Yeah, we just painted it. Those cones have not even touched the ground. Yeah, cones have not touched the ground. Something is not right. I think all of this is a front. The young guy here, city councilman, this is the front right here. Well, don't want to find out, folks. Let's call the city hall. Yes, ma'am. Good morning. How are you today? Great. I was wanting to ask you guys a question. I'm calling in reference to Guillermo Willie Rios. Is he one of y'all city councilmen? He is. Okay. I'll put it in this way, brother. There may not be dope in this vehicle, but they're not working this vehicle, that's for sure. Well, I mean, yeah, that's obvious. I think it has to be
was gonna throw away all these computers until I found an extra PC. All right, if you give me 60 seconds, I'm gonna show you how to fix any.
What's going on, man? You know what I'm stopping you for? Man, when you turned on here on the Dixie, on 18th Street, you turned in the far left lane, you're supposed to turn in the right lane. So that's 2 lanes. That's the reason why I'm doing. But then you can button your car, no drugs, get your ID. No, you ain't got any guns, right? You good, man? I'm sorry? Hey, yeah, speak down. All this. You say something about work?
I'm gonna check that.
Give me back the transfer steroid. Give me back your phone and your walk stick on.
Why?
Because I'm telling you, or it's gonna fall out when you get out of the vehicle.
Why are you taking me out the vehicle?
Oh, leave it up here for me.
Mama, they're taking me out the vehicle.
So how about?
They're telling me to get out the car now.
That's the reason why I didn't want anything on you. I don't want to bring your phone, bro. You don't have any weapons or anything. No drugs?
Nope.
Awesome. Turn around, put your hands on the phone. Switch feet.
I even did anything. Why are you checking me?
I didn't say you did anything. So you don't have any.
Why did you take me out the car?
Do you have any drugs ones on
I
your
don't. I told you
Do you
that
mind if I check?
the first time. I do not.
Okay, awesome. I'm gonna make sure I don't have any weapons, okay? No. Yeah, we're allowed to pat you down for weapons.
Mama, they pat me down.
Yeah, we're allowed to do that. Quit doing the clenching your fist thing, too. What's cool for it?
The only day I got off, I just want to go home. You close my door?
No.
Why?
I can't leave you to go close the door. Quit with the attitude. He's not giving you an attitude, and I'm not giving you an attitude. We deal with violent crime all day, every day. We're going to stop 30 more people after you. As soon as we get down here, you.
So I think you could see there that that young man from Louisville being told to quit with the attitude, that's really what I want to talk to you about today. And also, if you notice that he pulled into the second lane of traffic, didn't obstruct any other cars, but technically he did violate the law by pulling into that second lane of traffic. And what I want to really focus on today, among other things, is the idea that if you're behind the wheel of a car, you're breaking a law. And the police can choose to implement that law at their discretion. And I will say right up front that you know what I look like. I'm a middle-aged or 62-year-old white male college professor. I'm a pretty good driver. I'm not a dangerous driver, but I haven't been pulled over in over 25 years. I was pulled over several times when I was younger, but it's been quite a long time. And I know for a fact that I often break the law because I've studied the law now with respect to this book. And so it's not just speeding, but going under the speed limit can be said to be obstructing traffic, making a right turn, not coming to a full stop at a stop sign, etc. So the police have incredible discretion about whether or not to stop a vehicle. And they use that discretion as they choose. And what we have seen in the United States since the 1960s is a diversion of the traffic code into an excuse or an opportunity by the police to do something that they can't do to individuals walking down the street or in their homes because people have a greater degree of privacy. But if you're behind the wheel of a car, you are breaking some law, and therefore you open yourself up to criminal investigation. During that traffic stop, the police officer can ask you various questions. And you saw in these two encounters The questions go immediately to, are you carrying guns? Are you transporting drugs in your vehicle? Would you mind if I search the vehicle? And so that's the subject matter that I want to talk to you about today. So what I'm going to do in this talk is give you some background about our book, Suspect Citizens, that was published in 2018. Review the findings of various research projects I've been involved in that are follow-ups or parallel projects to that study. And I want to talk a little bit, very briefly, about another research project that I'm involved in with some graduate students about contact with the criminal justice system as it relates to the size of the local police department rather than the amount of crime in the community. And then I hope that we'll have plenty of time for comments and questions. So let me give you the background about and some greatest hits of our 2018 book, which was done with Derek Epp, who's now an assistant professor at the University of Texas, and Kelsey Schub, who's an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. Both were PhD students here at Carolina. We evaluate, for the most part in our book, and I'll mention very briefly who gets pulled over, but for the most part what we look at is what happens after the stop is initiated. Traffic stops suffer from what is called in the literature the baseline problem. We don't really know who's out there driving unless we do extensive tests of the driving population. And it's questionable to compare who gets pulled over to the demographic groups of people who live in the community, because we don't know that everybody who lives in the community is necessarily driving the same amount. And we don't know if they are they driving badly, or are they driving in compliance with the law? But I think it is fair to understand, or fair to assume actually, that virtually every driver is violating the law. And I would challenge you to watch yourself and watch other people driving and just look at the speed limit. And you'll see that virtually everybody is routinely going over the speed limit, which is mostly fine. It's not excessive. I mean, when it's not excessive, I don't think it's a big problem, but it does open every one of us to a police investigation, since we are criminals in the eyes of the law if we violate the law. The North Carolina law includes 516 traffic violations or vehicle equipment violations. And you might look up the Georgia code. I'm sure that you'll see a similarly large number of technical violations of the law associated with driving or how to maintain your vehicle. The US Supreme Court has routinely upheld the option and the discretion of police officers nationwide to use the traffic stop as a way to have a short conversation with an individual that amounts to an informal criminal investigation. I want to point out that in 2019, the state of Oregon had a very interesting Supreme Court decision where they said that because an individual is pulled over for a violation of the law, it doesn't mean that the police can search the vehicle if the search of the vehicle would not contain information explaining the reason for the violation of the law. So if you think back to that young man who was pulled over for an illegal right turn in Louisville, Kentucky, that same type of traffic stop occurred in Oregon, and the car was searched, something was found, the person was arrested, and the person contested the justification for the search. And the Supreme Court ruled in Oregon that searching the car for guns or drugs or kidnapped children would not elucidate the reasons for an illegal right turn. It wasn't an evasive action. It was simply a right turn into the second lane of traffic. And they threw out that search. And they said that searches have to be related to the object of the illegal behavior. So anyway, I'm going to talk about whether or not a car gets searched, or a driver or passengers are searched following a traffic stop. The good thing about this indicator is that it's a clear sign that the officer views the person, the driver or the passenger, with suspicion of criminal activity, It's not necessary for the officer to do it in order to understand why they may have been speeding, but it's a sign that the officer is using that traffic stop as an opportunity for a short criminal investigation. Now, I want to point out that traffic stops generally do not lead to search. In North Carolina, it's less than 5% of the time, which I think is similar in most other states. So as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, North Carolina has been collecting this database for quite a long time. And in fact, we were the first state in the nation to mandate the data collection. It followed from some investigative reporting in 1996. It was picked up by the Legislative Black Caucus in our General Assembly, which is actually quite a sizable Black caucus in the state legislature. There was bipartisan support. It was passed in 1999, and it applied only to the Highway Patrol. It was expanded in 2001 so that as of 2002, January 1st, 2002, it applies to virtually every police agency in the state of North Carolina, with very few exceptions, mostly small departments. So we know for every traffic stop since 2002, demographics of the driver, why the car was pulled over, what the outcome was, whether there was a warning, a citation, or an arrest, whether or not there was a search, whether or not contraband was found as a result of that search. We know the officer ID number, but that number is anonymous, so we can correlate all the traffic stops by the same officer, but we don't know who that officer is. Okay. Further, we know the time and the agency that conducted the stop, but we don't know the precise location. The form is a simple 2-page traffic stop form that every officer fills out. There's an electronic version of this, of course, but this is the result. This is the object. This is the database that I've analyzed. First, let me just say who gets pulled over. In 2010, North Carolina's population was 68% white, but the traffic stops were 60% white. Black North Carolinians were 22% of the population, but they were 32% of the traffic stops, and so on. And we can look at it in another way, the population size compared to the number of traffic stops. And you can see that on the bottom, white North Carolinians had an odds of about 13% to be pulled over in a given year in 2010. Blacks were pulled over at a rate of 22%. They had 22% odds, and so there's a quite substantial increase in the likelihood that the black driver would be pulled over compared to the white driver. And I want to note that these are substantial underestimates of this driving while black phenomenon, because according to the US Department of Transportation, white Americans and wealthier people tend to drive more than African Americans and people with lower income. And they estimate that this is about 16%, roughly speaking. So these differences in the odds of being pulled over per population underestimate the true racial disparity. We can look at every community, every municipality in the state of North Carolina and compare their population characteristics. So on the bottom of these two scales, I've laid out the percent of the population in every municipality in North Carolina that is white on the left or black on the right. And then on the vertical scale, the percent of all the traffic stops concerning white drivers or black drivers. And you can see that the traffic stops tend to be lower than the population share among white drivers, but they tend substantially to be higher than the population share among black drivers. So that's as far as I'm going to go with regards to who gets pulled over. These are questionable and difficult estimates, but I think the evidence is pretty strong that there is indeed a substantially greater likelihood of being pulled over if you're African American. What I really want to focus on, though, is the outcome of the traffic stop, because here I think we have much better numbers. We know every traffic stop. There's no missing data. For every traffic stop, we know what was the outcome. And for every traffic stop, we know whether or not a search was conducted. So there's no benchmark problem. We've got the universe of every traffic stop, over 25 million of them as of today, 20 million in the analysis I'm doing. And so, for example, we can say, what's the odds that you'll be searched? Well, for a young black man, the odds are about 4%. But for my wife, who is a white female over the age of 50, the odds are about 0.4%. Okay, so we can see the difference in the rates of search in this simple comparison. I want to point out a couple things about this graph. There's clearly a race effect, but the race effect is really only among men. The black males have much higher rates of search than the white males, but among females, you don't see very much, a very substantial race effect. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Also, we see a very great age effect where younger men are much more targeted by the criminal justice system or the object of suspicion because they fit a stereotype. Now, searches differ dramatically by time of day. These are the percent of traffic stops that lead to a search based on the time of day. So you can see that around 2 o'clock in the morning, there is a very high rate of search. I should point out that if I were to plot out the number of traffic stops, it would look very different than this. So this is the percent of all the traffic stops that lead to a search. It's high when the bar is closed. It's very, very low at the morning rush hour. But I also want you to note that pick between noon and 6 p.m., the rate for male African Americans is much higher, 3 times higher than the rate for white males. Now, among females, you can see several differences. One is the scale is different on that graph. The rates are much, much lower. Second, during the day, the racial differences are not very high. The search rates are very, very low. And that when the bars close, it's the white females that are more targeted by the police officers for search compared to Hispanic and black females. So there's nothing automatic that this is going to be racially disparate where black drivers will be on the losing end of that disparity. In fact, sometimes we see it the other way. It shows how closely targeted this is. I want to introduce the concept of the search rate ratio, which is the best indicator that I think, a very simple indicator that has robust implications. The search rate ratio is simply the rate of search for black drivers divided by that rate for white drivers. So in North Carolina, the rate for black drivers on average is just over 5%. For white drivers, it's 2.3%. So that ratio, divide one by the other, the ratio is 2.15. That means that the black driver is 115% more likely to be searched given a traffic stop. Now that could potentially be explained away by various other factors. Perhaps the black drivers are pulled over at different times of day by different agencies. Maybe they live in different communities and have more aggressive policing standards. Maybe they were pulled over for speeding and the white drivers are pulled over for stop sign violations, etc. So we have done the most complete logistic regression available using all the variables available in the data set, including a measurement of whether the officer who conducted the stop has a pattern of racially disparate outcomes. In any case, when we do this, and we've done it in North Carolina and in several other states, it's a slightly different regression in each case, depending on what variables are available, given that state's data collection. We get an odds ratio showing a 94% increased likelihood of search for the black driver compared to the white driver. So the odds go down from 115% increased odds to only 94% increased odds. Okay, so it is true that some little bit of the disparity is explained away, but very, very little. The search rate ratio and the logistic regression odds ratio correlate almost perfectly. And here I'm showing you across 4 states, 1,900 police agencies. The scatter plot shows the search rate ratio along the bottom, and then the logistic odds ratio based on the fullest regression that we can do. I want to point out that where the vertical and horizontal lines intersect in the lower left, that's the point of racial equality. That's where the ratios or the odds ratios are 1.0. And you can see that almost every single agency is either to the right of that point or to the above that point. Okay, so that means that there is a substantial racial disparity in about 98 to 99% of all the police agencies that we've investigated. And sometimes those disparities are quite substantial, 5, 6, 7, 8 times higher odds of search for the Black driver, even controlling for other factors. Now we know also whether contraband was seized as a result of these traffic stops, and we have several different measures of how much contraband was seized depending on what type of contraband was found. But every single one of them looks like the graph that I'm showing you now, which is how many ounces of contraband were seized. And typically, it's the smallest category available in the data collection instrument, often a trivial amount of contraband. We can predict the search rate ratio by looking at how many Blacks are members of the local city council and how large the Black community is and what share of African Americans represented in the most recent election. So we create an index of political power. And I want to note that what I'm showing you here is the predicted search rate ratio. So higher numbers mean that there are worse outcomes for Blacks compared to whites. 1.0 means that Blacks and whites have an equal rate of search. And then we have the predicted probability in the 95% confidence interval. And when we look at the right-hand side of this distribution, you can see that we reach a point of equity when the Black political power in that municipality reaches its highest levels. The other way of thinking about that, though, is when we look at the very white communities with very low political power for African Americans, we see very, very high rates of racial disparity in the police outcomes. We can also look at the share of traffic stops that are for broken taillights, expired tags, and other such investigatory stop purposes as compared to speeding, running stop signs, and drunk driving, which are clearly focused on traffic safety. And the more that the police agency focuses on those non-safety related items, more on the investigatory items, the greater the racial disparities in traffic stops in those communities. Now, one of the most effective reforms that we've found in North Carolina is a form that asks the driver to put their signature on a piece of paper before they agree to a consent search. And the consent search form indicates to the driver that they have the constitutional right not to sign that form. So very few people sign this form. But I want to compare 2 implementations of this very effective and I think very helpful reform in police practices. The first is in Durham and the second is in Fayetteville. Relatively similar towns. No 2 towns are identical. But in the case of Durham, the form was mandated by the city council over the objections of the police department. And what we see in the left-hand side there is that the form was very effective in reducing almost down to 0 the number of consent searches that were conducted by the Durham Police Department. And the vertical lines indicate when the reform was enacted, you can see a dramatic reduction in the number of consent searches. But then also, there was a corresponding sharp increase in the number of probable cause searches. Our understanding of this is that the police leadership was so opposed to this reform that they simply told their officers to substitute. In Fayetteville, there was a very similar process, but the police leadership bought into the reform. And so we saw in Fayetteville no corresponding substitution effect. And in fact, probable cause searches also declined quite dramatically after a new police chief was brought in who spearheaded even further reforms in the city of Fayetteville. Now, we followed up on this issue of whether this is an effective reform by following up on this new reformist police chief in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And what we found was that crime continued to go down, but the community members began to have greater trust in the police, and they called 911 in greater numbers given the decline in crime. So we think that this was at least suggestive evidence that not only is it dangerous for the police to alienate communities, but simple reforms can not only are compatible with greater public safety, but they lead to greater public trust, which in turn leads to greater public communication and cooperation with the police, which in turn can enhance public safety. So we think that these reforms that people are demanding in terms of less aggressive police tactics can have very, very effective or positive outcomes if they are met with support from the police leadership. Now, that's a quick summary of a lot of information. I want to give you some highlights about some extensions to the book that we published in 2018 in other states or in other jurisdictions. The reason why we went into these other jurisdictions was because every jurisdiction seems to make up or include a slightly different set of variables. So it allows us to do some double checking, some robustness checking, and to explore some other hypotheses about what drives racial disparities. And I would just say, to summarize it, every time we can find an indicator of a stereotype, that indicator of a stereotype also predicts racially disparate search practices in the police department. I'll show you a few. One is we looked across the municipalities of the state of North Carolina and I think in the state of Illinois, looking for the share of the municipal budget that comes from fines and fees. And we found that the higher the share of the budget that comes from fines and fees, the greater the racial disparity in the search rates. We found having a Black police chief reduces racial disparities, mandating written consent forms reduces racial disparities. Communities that have a larger Black population tend to have a greater number of African Americans on the city council, and Blacks are a more substantial voting force in local elections, and those factors also reduce racial disparities. Factors that increase racial disparities are poverty, low education levels, higher crime rate, reliance on fines and fees, and so on. We continue to find more things that relate to this. I want to mention the city of Charlotte presented on their website, although they took it down. I'm not sure if it was after they realized that I had pulled it, but they took down this data that used to be, that used to be publicly available. And it includes information about the demographics of the officer. And so in a class project with about 20 of my undergraduate students, we investigated that database. And I want to just share a couple things. We knew not only the identity of the officer, but we also knew the neighborhood where the traffic stop occurred. And we were able to link those neighborhoods with their census estimated income levels. So on the left-hand side, you can see the search rates for Black officers who pull over a white driver at the top. It's a very low search rate, 0.9%. And at the bottom, the white officer who pulls over a Black driver, the search rate is 7%. And similarly, we can see across the neighborhoods, or what the police call patrol districts of the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, the search rates differ from 1.2% in the South neighborhood to over 12% in the metro neighborhood. Now, what's different about those neighborhoods? Well, this shows that it really is about the income level of the people who live there. The two neighborhoods with the really high search rates have very, very low average household income rates. And the two neighborhoods with very high average income have very, very low search rates. So people living on different sides of town experience the police in very different ways. What I'm showing you here is the search rate for white male, Black male, white, Black, and other race, males and female drivers pulled over by white male officers in the black bar, and then in the gray bar, Black male officers. And you can see that the white male officers always have a much higher rate of search for any kind of driver, no matter their demographics. The white male officers are much more likely to search the car. But I want you to squint a little bit at that graph and look just at the gray bars. The rise in the percent of search for the Black officers is the same targeting behavior as among the white officers. That is, the Black officers are still much more likely to search the Black male drivers compared to how often they search the white male drivers. It's just that all of those numbers are substantially lower than when it's a white male officer. The only one that really differs is that the Black officers are extremely unlikely to search a white female driver. And we can speculate about why that might be. But with respect to the male drivers, the white and Black officers have similar targeting. They share the same idea of what's the stereotype of a criminal profile, and it's a Black male. But the Black officers are much less likely to search anybody. In a logistical regression setup, we can predict, using every predictor in the database, the odds of search. And here I'm showing you the driver race and gender on the left, holding everything else constant. You can see that the predicted odds of search for the Black male is much higher, almost 20% when we hold all the other factors constant, compared to females on the right-hand side of that graph on the left. But on the right-hand graph, we compare this by the officer race and gender. And you can see that people pulled over by white male officers are much more likely to be searched, other things being equal. So the officer effect is almost as great as the driver identity effect. We can compare in the city of Charlotte pretty much how many targets do you have on your back. Are you Black rather than white? Are you young rather than old? Are you male rather than female? Were you pulled over by a white male officer rather than somebody else? Were you pulled over by a relatively inexperienced officer? Was this traffic stop for an investigative purpose rather than a traffic safety purpose, such as speeding? And then what neighborhood in the city were you pulled over? Was it one of the leafy, wealthy neighborhoods? Was it the middle part of the city with the average rates of search, or was it in one of the high search rate neighborhoods with the greatest poverty? So we identified 8 possible targets, and we scored every driver a score of 0 to 8. And these are the search rates that result from that comparison. And if you look at the person with 8 characteristics that are targeted, that person's got a 34% odds of search That's a very high rate of search when the statewide average is 3. I want to mention one other thing about this. We compare all searches and then fruitless searches. Fruitless searches on the right-hand side here are searches that do not lead to the discovery of any contraband. Okay, so those searches are an indication that the search was of an innocent individual. And those are quite highly disparate. Okay, the numbers are lower than searches because one is a subset of the other. But in the middle graph, we show the rate of arrest. And you can see that the arrest rates do differ, and the people with the 8 targets are more likely to be arrested. But much of this targeting is inefficient targeting. It's not clearly and mathematically, statistically profiling the people who really need to be profiled. It's a rough and ready estimate based on stereotypes that does not correspond to actual criminal behavior, even in the eyes of the officer, since the officer has the discretion to arrest the individual. Okay. So we found that Black and female officers, as well as white male officers who have more experience, conduct fewer searches. They find contraband more frequently when they search, and they arrest a higher proportion of the people that they search. They avoid those fruitless searches. And fruitless searches are something that I think we really want to focus on in our discussion about traffic stops and community trust. Fruitless searches are searches that show the suspicion of the officer. They show the citizen, the driver, that the officer views them as a criminal suspect, but they reveal that the person had been innocent all along. So fruitless searches, I think, need to be more a part of our conversation. Now, I have focused mostly on the black-white comparison, and I think we have the best data to do that, but there is also a separate phenomenon that occurs with Latinx individuals. There's the same phenomenon that's happening with African Americans. The young man of color is targeted because of a stereotype of the criminal profile, but also enforcement, immigration enforcement might be a question for our Latinx friends. And immigration enforcement does not necessarily target young men. It could target people of any age, and it could target women just as much as it targets men. And also, it doesn't have to be related to searching the vehicle because you can simply ask for paper. So we don't have as good data on this, but I do want to mention it very briefly. And then finally, I want to mention, to wrap up my discussion about these traffic stop extensions, I want to mention a database we've just been analyzing recently from the Texas Highway Patrol, where we were able to get 10 million traffic stops covering several years of data. And the interesting thing here was that they indicated what kind of car was the person driving. And on the left-hand graph, I'm showing the vehicle type times whether the person was a Black, Hispanic, or white driver. And you can see that utility vans have a high rate of search. Passenger cars, motorcycles, SUVs, pickup trucks, lower, and at the very bottom is what we call occupational vehicles. Occupational vehicles are buses and professionally driven tractor trailers, so long haul trucks. So very low rates of search for those professional drivers, and then much more substantial rates of search for people driving passenger cars, SUVs, or in particular white panel vans. Okay, I want to point out just one interesting tidbit in that graph. If you look at the motorcycles, it's the only time when the Black search rate is lower than the white search rate. In the state of Texas, I think because of a tradition of white motorcycle gangs and Latinx motorcycle gangs being prominent in the drug trade, state troopers see with greater suspicion those white and Latinx motorcycle drivers than the African-American motorcycle drivers. So again, it's an exception to a general pattern, but one that still, I think, conforms to the idea that the police officer conducting the traffic stop is using visible cues and the correspondence of the driver and the setting and the type of vehicle and everything else that the officer can see, whether or not that corresponds to a stereotype of a criminal profile. Now, in the Texas data set, we also know whether that car is a Lexus, a Cadillac, or a Chevrolet. And so we identified whether there's a benefit of driving a luxury brand vehicle. And indeed, there's quite a substantial benefit for driving a luxury car. The solid lines in the graph on the right are the search rates for luxury cars. They go up over time as the car gets older. So we know how old the vehicle, the model year of the vehicle, and then we can subtract how old it is or calculate how old it is. And then the dotted lines show the search rates for people with cars that are not luxury brands. And then the three lines are for white men, black men, and Hispanic men. Black men are in the black line, not the lighter gray lines. And you can see that black men driving a non-luxury vehicle start out with a higher search rate than the white males driving a luxury vehicle. I think I misstated. I meant to say that the solid black line is for black drivers, black male drivers driving a luxury car. Okay. And they have a search rate of less than 1%. And the search rate for in the dotted line, the dotted black line, that's the black male drivers with a non-luxury vehicle. They have a much higher search rate. So there's a big luxury advantage for African-American men to buy a luxury vehicle, a Cadillac or something like that. But if you notice, that luxury advantage disappears over time until there is no advantage whatsoever once that car is older, 10 years old. For white males, at the bottom two lines in this graph show no depreciation over time, even as the car is over 10 years old. So there's a luxury advantage that white men can purchase by moving away from the criminal stereotype by driving a Lexus or a Beamer or a Mercedes or a Cadillac. And black men can purchase it. It's quite valuable. It reduces their traffic search rate quite substantially as long as the car is new, but it disappears over time. And then I have one little bit of tidbit of data that I want to present to you that's from some research that I'm doing right now with two of my former students who are now at other universities, Kanisha Johnson, who's now at Harvard pursuing her PhD, and Marty Davidson, who's now at Michigan, along with Christian Kieran, a current graduate student at UNC. We've been looking at every arrest in the state of North Carolina using the clerk's data from the administrative office of the courts. So this is the official database of the entire court system, which I was able to get through a public records request, and they're very cooperative and they will give this data out. It's a very difficult database to work with, but we have been able to calculate per population the odds that different individuals per population group, for each demographic group, the odds that people will have contact with the criminal justice system, that is to be arrested. Okay. And then we've compared rates of arrest per population across every municipality in the state of North Carolina with respect to how many police officers does that municipality have per 10,000 members of the population. So some communities are over-policed, some communities are under-policed, relatively speaking, one compared to the other. And what I want to show you here is very simple. That is, for every demographic group except for white people, for every other demographic group, Black men, Black women, Latinx men, Latinx women, Native American men, Native American women, the more police officers there are per capita in that community, the higher the odds that that someone in that community will be arrested, or that any person from that community will be arrested. There's always a positive, and sometimes a quite substantially sharp positive correlation between the number of police officers, the size of the police force, and the odds that people will be arrested from those demographic groups. But magically, there is none for white people, okay? So what do I want to say after this long summary of statistical patterns? First of all, there is no question that there is such a thing as driving while Black. Now, I often get asked from Black colleagues and Black audience members, did they really pay you to write this book? Because that's obvious, everybody knows that. And I have to chuckle and say, I knew that it was going to be true, but I didn't know exactly how true it would be or exactly what numbers we could put to it. So I think it is important to put some numbers to things, even when we suspect that we're going to find a certain outcome. This ubiquity of driving while Black is both in terms of the odds of being pulled over in the first place, as well as with the odds of adverse consequences from those traffic stops. And my focus has been on whether or not the car gets searched. It's not particular to North Carolina. It's a nationwide phenomenon. It's extremely robust. It's not explained away by statistical patterns such as whether people have older cars or out-of-state license plates or anything like that. It has very little crime fighting value. It's not in a statistically efficient way to fight the war on crime or the war on drugs. Further, we have at least suggestive evidence from the city of Charlotte that the officer demographics are almost as important as driver demographics in driving these differences. We know that there are several reforms that can be very effective in this if they're done in good faith. And I just want to mention that we are now, it's clear now that the traffic code is simply, among other things, the traffic code has been used as a means to conduct informal criminal investigations. And this is driven by stereotypes. It's got very little crime fighting value, and it alienates people. It causes humiliation, lack of trust, anger, frustration. And here's the part about it that I think is so interesting and why I was happy to share with you that last slide comparing arrest rates with the size of the local police force. It doesn't apply to white people. That is, people like me can be completely unaware that the police are using routine traffic stops in order to ask about kidnapped children or whether there's a gun in the car. I've never been asked that question. I've never been asked about whether or not I had drugs in the car after being pulled over for speeding. But many other people have had that experience all too often. Since the vast majority of these traffic stops do not lead to the arrest of the driver, even after a search, and even in fact, in North Carolina, half the time when contraband is found after a search, there's no subsequent arrest because the contraband is trivial, very small amounts only. So what we see in the data, I think really is something that should trouble all of us and helps us understand why Black and white Americans have such different expectations about the police and maybe such different reactions to demands that we hear currently to defund the police. So if this hasn't generated questions, I'm not sure what could possibly generate questions. I'm really happy to see that political scientists are taking race and identity really seriously. I believe that these have always been at the core of politics, and they need to be at the core of political science as well. So thank you very much, and I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Baumgartner. I will be monitoring the Q&A and be sharing some questions. We have a handful of questions, and I'm hoping that a handful of questions are submitted as we chat. I want to once again thank everybody. Especially want to thank you, Frank, for agreeing to do this, and also for each and every member of the audience, even though I can't see you. So this has been a struggle, this new format, and it's something that is challenging for participants as well as panelists such as Professor Baumgartner. I wanted to ask why it's, or maybe there were folks who have done this, but why it's taken so long to study and quantify driving while black, in that I remember hearing that expression 35, 40 years ago.
I think all it took was somebody to take the time to do it. And I think that's one of the difficulties in this kind of research, is that somebody has to be motivated who has the skills and the capacity to do the work. I mean, you're absolutely right. I as a student of agenda setting, I always kind of pay attention to issues that are kind of rising. And I remember in the 90s, this issue was rising, and Cornell West, if you recall, had been arrested several times because Cornell at the time dressed up. He always dresses nice, and he drives a Cadillac, and he was commuting between his two hardship positions at Harvard and Princeton. And so going between Harvard and Princeton involves driving up the Eastern Corridor, and he was pulled over, I don't know how many times. And finally it ended up in the New York Times about this issue of racial profiling. And he was a prominent part of that discussion. That is what led to the North Carolina enactment of the law. There was John Conyers in Congress was promoting legislation that never were enacted back in the 90s. Mm-hmm. But certainly it goes back to the 40s. There's nothing new about it. It's always been the case that there's disparate policing. And I think one of the things that's changed lately is that Black Lives Matter has sustained attention to disparate policing, rather than just seeing a spike in scholarly or media attention to disparate policing. We're seeing sustained attention to shootings and other measures of disparate policing over 5 years now. So I think I don't have a happy answer to your question. I think we could have studied it if we had wanted to.
TJ Bement is asking, making note of the fact that most of this data is from North Carolina, and he's wondering if what the likelihood is of data availability from other states that might be able to broaden the analysis.
There's a lot of data that I didn't really explain as much as maybe I should have. Some of our analysis is based on statewide comprehensive data from the state of Illinois. There's statewide data from Maryland. There's statewide from Vermont. Not that there's that much traffic in Vermont, but there is at least a database. The Texas Highway Patrol. I've looked at the Florida Highway Patrol. There's a new law in California that mandates data collection. So there's a mishmash, a strange patchwork of coverage of traffic stops data. And what we see is similar patterns everywhere. We don't see North Carolina being different than elsewhere. We also don't see any bright spots of happiness and racial equity in policing anywhere. So it's a nationwide issue, and while we don't have nationwide data, I think the patterns are similar virtually everywhere.
We have another question. I am not sure if this is Axe Scott or Scott Axe, but and I'm going to paraphrase the question. And the question is, what about the passengers in the car? So when you have mixed races within the car, do you see patterns? Do you have enough data on that, or is there even data collected on that?
Unfortunately, that's a very good question. And I can tell from personal experience going back to when I was a child, a mixed race passengers back in the 1970s and 60s in Detroit, Michigan was a problem for a lot of police officers, and they didn't like to see it. And so it led to adverse actions on the part of the police, but that's anecdotal. And that also, that's a long time ago. You would think it would have changed by now. Unfortunately, what we have for passengers is data, at least in North Carolina, the data on passengers is only collected if there's an adverse outcome, such as an arrest or a search. So we don't have the full census of all the passengers, so we can't calculate any rates. I can tell you anecdotally that like one time I was giving a talk on this topic, and one of my colleagues here at UNC, the African-American woman, was describing her experience. She had been a college athlete, and she was with 4 other athletes in a car, and all those other athletes were male football players, approximately the size of Mount Rushmore. And when the police officer pulled them over with the car of 5 people, 5 African Americans, 1 woman, and 4 men, and found out that it was the entire, set of linebackers from the, I think it was either UNC or UVA football team, the officer didn't know what to do because he was scared, and he called for backup because these men were so large. And she said they had never been so scared in their lives as when they saw the backup cars arrive, because of their size, and they just didn't know what the police might do. Now it ended up okay. They were all safe at the end of the encounter, but she told me that story as if it had happened yesterday, and it had been over 30 years in the past when it happened. So police do pay attention to how many people are in the vehicle, and it can lead to problems.
Michael Pennington is asking a question that gets into a little bit of the nitty-gritty here. So do you have information about the municipalities adopting traffic codes as municipal codes? So in the state of Georgia, municipalities can do that, and sometimes that affects criminal activity or affects the data that's captured in driver histories, criminal histories.
In North Carolina, the data collection instrument only mentions 10 reasons why the car got pulled over. And so those can be kind of combinations of various precise municipal or state codes. So the short answer is no, we can't really go down to that level. We don't have the arrest records. I can say that I think there's a very useful reform, which is not to allow any government agency to retain any funds collected on the basis of criminal justice actions. And, you think of the old-fashioned speed trap. That would be a municipality that has some jurisdiction over an interstate highway could set up a speed trap and generate a lot of revenue from outsiders. And so I think we all remember or can think about times when we've gotten a speeding ticket when it seemed to be extractive policing. But that's just extraction. What we're talking about here is racial profiling and racial disparities in policing. And I think that we have to be careful about the incentives that we set up for local municipalities to engage in any kind of such action. Whether or not it's extracting money from outsiders, which is preferable, of course, to elected officials than extracting taxes from citizens in the municipality, but it's still not fair to those outsiders. So I think we really could have an easy solution, which is separate out the revenue from the policing.
Does North Carolina collect data on pedestrian violations to the same extent?
No, we don't. Nor I think the city of New York is the only one that really has these really extensive stop and frisk data sets about pedestrians. But the patterns that we see there are kind of similar, although they're more extreme in New York because there's such high numbers, or at least there used to be such high numbers of people encountered on the sidewalks and then let go after a conversation, and very, very low rates of actual crime fighting. But I think that is, extracting guns or finding contraband or arresting people. But there was a lot of showing police force, I think.
Right.
And I think there is something about that's what's happening in neighborhoods in North Carolina and in other states where we've looked at the data. There's something about what the police call high crime neighborhoods, what you or I might call low income neighborhoods, or the black side of town, or high minority population neighborhoods, a much more aggressive form of policing that most middle-class white Americans are really not familiar with. And if you happen to live in one of those high crime neighborhoods and you have a son who has to go to school, that can be a dangerous trajectory for him just to get across the neighborhood to his high school.
So there have been a couple of folks who've asked about the measure of black. Is that from a license or a driver's license, or is that the officers who stop the vehicle who make that assessment?
I believe black and white is, it's recorded on the form. It should come from the driver's license, but it's recorded by the officer on the form. I can tell you that I'm relatively comfortable with the black-white data. The Hispanic information is much more questionable. Officers, for example, almost no Hispanics, which is on our form is listed as it often is as an ethnicity separate from race. Almost no Hispanics are coded as also being black. So there's no Afro Latinos. And I don't believe that that's true. So I think there's some kind of ambiguity in the officer's ability to, or inaccuracies in the recording of Hispanic. But I think for white and black, the data are probably better.
So I want to combine a couple questions here. We have questions from Seth Robinson, I believe it was Sandra Mitchell, a handful of folks. And they revolve around the possibility of reform. And so one possibility is altering funding circumstances and or composition of city council, makeup of city council, funding of police. Another possibility is training of police. African American officers follow the same pattern as non-African American officers. They just do it at a lower rate. Okay, so and I understand that one might say we should do all of those things, but which of those areas do you think would make the greatest impact in terms of ameliorating this issue?
I think that there's a lot of frustration in the world surrounding criminal justice issues. And for the most part, there's a frustration associated with the high rates of crime that Americans suffer with and the very high rates of homicide that Americans suffer. And we have over time, which our country has a lot of violence. And so because of the violence, and through some kind of frustration and reasonable response to violence is to crack down on crime and to do, quote unquote, do something about it. But if we look at what we're afraid of is violent assaults, I think. I mean, that's what I would be afraid of. And when we look at what's in the criminal justice system, it's low-level infractions. I have a friend who wrote a paper about the war on drugs, and it's entitled "Fishing for Sharks, but Finding Only Minnows." And the point is that we can justify a lot of criminal justice policies and policing practices based on the fact that there's some high-level drug kingpins out there ruining our communities, or that there's some violent predators who are out there serially assaulting people and committing homicide. That's true. There are some terrible criminals out there. But when we look at who's being arrested, it's breaking and entering, it's vandalism, it's drug possession for the most part, and sometimes low-level drug distribution or sales. And we have over-policed so many communities and generated so many millions and millions of low-level arrests for low-level infractions and low-level crimes, non-violent crimes, in the name of fighting violent crimes. So I think one thing is we should understand how we're not getting the bang for the buck that we were promised with the war on crime, because we're not fighting the kinds of crimes that you and I are all afraid of, which is, you know, being assaulted or, you know, being robbed with and shot during a robbery. That's not the crimes that statistically are showing up in the data associated with who's going to prison. Those crimes are probably in our data set in North Carolina, they're about 3%. Violent crimes, serious violent crimes, are about 3% of all the felonies.
Mm-hmm.
About 80% of all the felonies are drug possession and drug sales and distribution. So we have, I think, really accepted a bad deal. And through our fear of violent crime, we've accepted a contract, and perhaps it's related to this political magic that I mentioned, which is it's not affecting middle-class white Americans. Those policies that are so ineffective in fighting and eliminating violent, serious crime, serious violent crime, they're very ineffective, but they're really targeted in poor neighborhoods, among poor people of color in particular. And so no wonder there's a frustration with the political system and the police that's felt very, very strongly in minority communities, which is slightly bewildering to many middle-class white Americans, because we don't have that frustration with the police. So I would say that about criminal justice in general. And then with regards to traffic stops in particular, I think we've also taken a bad deal. The deal was that the police are going to have to pull over 10,000 people in order to find a contraband, a drug courier, a serious amount of drugs being moved in a car. And it's true that drugs do get moved around the country in vehicles, but the problem is we can't tell by looking at the vehicles whether it's got drugs in it or guns or kidnapped children, as that state trooper in Texas justified his traffic stop of Mr. Rios. And so we've taken this agreement that 10,000 innocent people will have to be humiliated by the side of the road before we find a few people worthy of arrest. And I think it's part of that same political magic. They're not doing it to people that look like you and me, Scott. They're doing it to people that look like Guillermo Willie Rios. He's a city councilman in his town, and he happens to keep his truck clean. And he was humiliated and distracted. And probably it wasn't the first time, and it probably won't be the last time that he got subjected to that inconvenience and humiliation. So I think we don't take it seriously because it's not happening to middle-class white people.
I want to try to squeeze in two last questions. One deals with slide 35, which I don't think you need to pull back up if you don't want to, but that was the one that showed the number of police officers within a community and then arrest rates by race. And they're slightly related questions, but maybe there are two or three questions here. So one thing was, is there an optimal police force size that you have considered, or that you might think about. And then the other is that the population or the police density for the white population, that range is very narrow, whereas the range for the non-white populations is very wide. And so you get a lot of you get a lot of range in those non-white populations. I was wondering if you get the same effects within that more narrow band of policing per 10,000.
I could share that screen back, but actually I think it's the opposite, that the way the scale was on the horizontal side, the scale is that for the white population, it goes from 1 to 7. And for some of the others, it goes to 1 to 4.5 or 1 to 4, something like that. So, but in any case, I mean, and largely that's simply because every community has larger numbers of white people than they have some, especially Native Americans. The numbers, there's not that many Native Americans, and so we can't estimate a number for every community.
Right.
But what's the right, how can we right size the police? I mean, I really think we have to ask questions about how do we target the crimes that we really are concerned about? And how do we assign punishments that are appropriate to the crime? And I think that we should be able to recognize that we could take a lot of things away without, I mean, decriminalizing marijuana, for example, is a policy that people are doing left and right around the country. And I don't think that it's going to lead to anything but positive outcomes after maybe an adjustment period when people are smoking out in public a lot. And I know some states have had to deal with, you know, some inconveniences around that transition period. And I know that in the country of Portugal, they decriminalized hard drugs. And for about 3 years, they had some serious problems because people were engaging in heroin tourism to go to Portugal to do serious drugs. And it was a big problem. But after about 3 years, it settled down, and they've really benefited from decriminalizing a lot of these things. And I come at this not from anybody who's like a drug user or interested in drug use or anything like that, but the vast majority of the people in our prisons are there for drug-related crimes. Yeah. And a lot of the violent crime also stems from people feeding addictions. And so I think we really have to think about, why did we decide to fight the war on drugs with handcuffs and prison time rather than with mental health counseling and other kinds of medicalized approaches? What's the right size of the police force? I don't know, a lot smaller, but also a lot more targeted on violent, serious crimes, of which there's really not that much. I mean, there's too much. Any homicide is one too many homicides, believe me. But we don't need the size of these police forces. If we took drugs out of the picture, if we took low-level things like loitering, why do people need to be arrested for loitering and trespassing? And well, maybe trespassing, depending. But jaywalking, we have too many laws on the books. Our traffic codes are a farce of making, it's like a dictatorship. Everything you do renders you subject to the whims of the state, and the actor, the state actor may choose or not choose to enforce the law. Yeah. So if everybody's guilty, and then you may or may not get grace from a state actor, that's a dictatorship. And unfortunately, you know, that's a good explanation of the traffic code. There is one other reform that I think is useful, Scott. I'll just say really quickly, and that is, why does the person who gives you a speeding ticket need to have handcuffs and a gun? One way to reorganize the police is to have a separate unit that does traffic control, that's targeted on bad drivers. but which is separate from the criminal investigations. So that then, and again, there would be a difficult period of transition.
Yeah.
But after we got through that period of transition, someone who gets pulled over for an illegal right turn would understand that they really did get pulled over for that reason, and they're
And
about to
nothing
get
else.
they're about to get a ticket. But they're not going to have to undergo a humiliating conversation and a scary conversation with an agent of the state who's got a gun about whether they've got drugs in the car, or whether they have a gun, or whether they're just leaving the scene of a robbery. Now, there might very well be need for police officers to pull people over who did just leave the scene of a robbery and to do an actual criminal investigation based on a suspect profile. Fair enough. But you can't expect people to appreciate traffic stops as traffic stops when in fact they're pretexts for an informal criminal investigation. So one way to change things that I've seen around the country growing is the idea of separating out traffic enforcement from criminal investigations.
I know that is done in some nations. Very last question. What are the things that you think future scholars, the next generation of scholars, should be pursuing in regards to this topic?
I really think alternative form, I mean, I think that future generations should study whatever they want. I study whatever I want. You should study whatever you want to study. Things that we have failed to study, I think, are alternative forms of political participation, how people get motivated into politics. And I think there is a new generation of criminal justice scholars who really are taking seriously this question of what they call subjugated communities, and how people mobilize to demand their political voice and assert their political voice when they're on the receiving end of a lot of punitive public policies. So I think understanding how poor people behave, understanding how marginalized people mobilize into politics, understanding how the immigrant community gets involved in politics. There's any number of things. Yeah. But I would just say that's one of the fantastic things about being a scholar. You can study whatever you feel like.
So Professor Baumgartner, I want to say thank you once again. You truly have led a career where you have pursued questions of interest to you. I know that from having read much of your work. I did not mention some of might have been your very first book on the French Republic, but that is a very rich and storied career, and we're fortunate to have you as our guest. I can't help but to say I do wish we could take you downtown to one of our finer restaurants, but that will have to happen after this pandemic. So once more, a hearty round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure. Thanks so much.